A 9-year-old girl, clutching a crumpled funeral flyer, walked straight up to a 250-pound Hell's Angel covered in tattoos and made an impossible request. What followed wasn't a scene from a movie. It was a thunderous 700-motorcycle spectacle that shook an entire town to its core and redefined Brotherhood. It was a blistering Tuesday afternoon in July, the kind of day in Aldale, California, where the heat waves off the asphalt made the horizon blur and dance. At pump number 4 of a rundown Texaco station, Arthur Bears Sterling was topping off the tank of his customized Harley-Davidson Road King. Bear was not a man people approached lightly, standing 6'4", with arms thicker than most men's thighs, a thick, graying beard, and the infamous death head patch of the Hells Angels motorcycle club stitched onto the back of his heavy leather cut. He was the very picture of intimidation. Bear was minding his own business, wiping a speck of oil off his chrome exhaust, when he felt a faint, hesitant tap on his leather vest. He turned, his brow furrowed in a natural scowl, fully expecting a local panhandler or a teenager looking for trouble. Instead, his eyes had to travel downward way down to meet the gaze of a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 9. She wore faded denim overalls, scuffed Converse sneakers, and her blonde hair was pulled into a messy ponytail. Her face was streaked with dirt and dried tears, and her lower lip was trembling so hard she had to bite it to keep it still. "Excuse me, mister," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the idle rumble of a passing truck. Bear slowly straightened up, towering over her like a redwood tree. He glanced around the desolate gas station. "Where's your folks, kid? You lost?" The girl shook her head, holding out a single crumpled piece of cheap printer paper. Her small hands were shaking. Bear reluctantly took the paper. It was a hastily made funeral announcement. A blurry black-and-white photo of a teenage boy smiled back at him. Beneath it, the text read, "In loving memory of Daniel Miller, 2010-2026. That's my big brother," the girl said, her voice cracking. "My name is Chloe." Bear looked at the flyer, then back down at Chloe. "I'm sorry for your loss, Chloe. But why are you showing this to me?" Chloe sniffled, rubbing her nose with the back of her dirty hand. Daniel loved motorcycles. He had magazines all over his room. He used to sit on the porch and watch you guys ride by on the highway. He said one day he was going to get a bike and ride away from this place. Bear's hardened expression softened just a fraction. He knew the allure of the road, the promise of freedom it held for kids trapped in dead-end towns. "Sounds like he had good taste," Bear rumbled gently. "But you shouldn't be out here alone." "I need your help," Chloe blurted out, the tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "The funeral is this Friday at the old St. Jude's Chapel on the edge of town. But nobody is coming." Bear frowned, crouching down so he was closer to her eye level. The leather of his cut creaked. "What do you mean nobody's coming?" "Funerals are usually packed with family and friends." Chloe shook her head violently, sobbing now. "We don't have family. My dad left a long time ago, and my mom, she hasn't gotten out of bed since Daniel died. And Daniel didn't have any friends left. The kids at his high school, they were really mean to him, mister. We don't have a lot of money, and they made fun of his clothes. They pushed him into lockers. They posted awful things about him on the internet." She paused, struggling to catch her breath, and the next words she spoke hit Bear like a physical blow to the chest. They were so mean to him that Daniel decided he didn't want to live anymore. He hurt himself last week. He's gone. Chloe looked up into the biker's eyes, her own filled with a desperate, crushing sorrow that no child should ever carry. "The school isn't doing anything. The parents of the boys who bullied him told everyone in our neighborhood not to go to the funeral, so they wouldn't look bad. The church is going to be empty, and the funeral director said we need 6 people to carry his heavy box." She stepped closer, placing a tiny hand on Bear's massive, tattooed forearm. Mister, can you carry my brother's casket? Please. I don't want him to go into the ground all alone." "Not Sutcore. For a long, agonizing moment, the gas station was completely silent, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights above. Bear, a man who had seen the darkest corners of the world, who'd lived a life of violence, brotherhood, and harsh realities, felt a sudden, sharp lump form in his throat. He looked at the little girl's desperate grip on his arm. He thought of his own childhood, of the cruelties of the world, and of the sacred weight of carrying a brother to his final rest. The Hells Angels are fiercely protective of their own, but they are not a charity organization. They operate by their own strict code. Yet looking into Chloe's tear-filled eyes, the code shifted. Bear gently placed his large calloused hand over hers. "What time Friday, Chloe?" 10 in the morning, she whispered. "You go home. You take care of your mom," Bear said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He folded the flyer and slipped it carefully into the breast pocket of his cut, right over his heart. "Your brother won't be alone. I promise you that." 30 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the Hells Angels local charter clubhouse swung open. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke, the smell of stale beer, and the low murmur of deep voices. At the far end of the long wooden table sat William Dutch Hollister, the president of the charter. Dutch was a veteran of the road, a man whose word was absolute law within the club. Bear walked the length of the room, the heavy thud of his boots drawing the attention of the patched members lounging around the pool table and the bar. He didn't say a word until he reached the head of the table. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the crumpled flyer, and flattened it out on the wood in front of Dutch. Dutch took a slow drag from his cigarette, exhaling a thick plume of grey smoke before looking down at the paper. "Who's the kid, Bear?" "His name was Daniel," Bear said, his voice echoing slightly in the sudden quiet of the room. 16 years old. Hanged himself in his bedroom last Thursday. A murmur rippled through the room. The men gathered closer. Bear recounted the story exactly as Chloe had told him. He spoke of the grinding poverty, the relentless, cruel bullying by the wealthy kids at the local high school, the mother paralyzed by grief, and the ultimate, devastating twist, the town's collective decision to sweep the tragedy under the rug. He explained how the bullies' families had pressured the community to boycott the funeral to avoid a scandal, leaving a 9-year-old girl wandering the streets begging strangers to be pallbearers for her dead brother. When Bear finished, the silence in the clubhouse was deafening. The anger in the room was palpable, a heavy, suffocating pressure. These were men who lived outside the bounds of polite society, men who had been judged and shunned themselves. They possessed a visceral hatred for bullies and cowards. Dutch stared intently at the blurry photo of the smiling teenager. For a long time, he didn't move. What none of the newer members knew but Bear remembered vividly was that 20 years ago, Dutch's own nephew had taken his life under terrifyingly similar circumstances. The old wounds, long scarred over by time and leather, suddenly tore wide open. Dutch slowly stubbed out a cigarette in a heavy glass ashtray. He looked up, his eyes cold and hard as flint. "The funeral is Friday morning at 10. Dutch asked. "Yeah," Bear nodded. "At St. Jude's." "Zur. The little girl just wanted me and maybe a few of the guys to carry the casket, just so he wouldn't go out alone." Dutch stood up, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. He picked up the flyer. A kid who loved the road, hunted down by cowards until he couldn't take it anymore. And now they want to erase him like he never existed. Dutch's voice began to rise, vibrating with a terrifying, righteous fury. They want him to go quietly. They want to pretend this didn't happen. Dutch turned to his sergeant-at-arms, a massive man known as Iron Mike. "Mike, get on the horn. Call the presidents in Oakland. Call San Jose. Call the nomads out in Nevada. Send this flyer to every charter up and down the West Coast." Bear's eyes widened slightly. "Dutch, you want to involve the coast." "I don't want just 6 guys carrying this boy," Dutch roared, slamming his fist onto the table. I want the whole damn world to know his name. I want those bullies and their miserable parents to look out their windows on Friday morning and shake in their boots. We're going to give Daniel Miller the loudest, proudest, most earth-shattering send-off this state has ever seen. Over the next 48 hours, an unprecedented mobilization occurred. Word spread through the highly organized, tightly knit underworld of the Hells Angels with astonishing speed. The story of the bullied boy and the brave little sister struck a nerve that transcended charter lines and state borders. Phones rang incessantly in clubhouses from Los Angeles to the Pacific Northwest. Mechanics worked through the night, tuning engines and polishing chrome. The call to ride wasn't an obligation. It became a point of fierce honor. No club member was going to let that boy be buried in silence. Meanwhile, back in Oildale, Thursday night settled over the town with a stifling, ignorant calm. The parents of the bullies sat in their air-conditioned homes, sipping wine, confident that their pressure campaign had worked. They believed Friday would come and go quietly, the embarrassing tragedy buried along with the poor kid from the wrong side of the tracks. At a small, dilapidated house on the edge of town, Chloe sat on her front porch under a flickering yellow bud light. She hugged her knees to her chest, looking down the empty, dark street. She wondered if the giant man with the beard had forgotten about her. She wondered if anyone would come at all. What Chloe didn't know, what the entire town of Oildale couldn't possibly comprehend, was that under the cover of darkness, hundreds of miles of highway were currently vibrating. Convoys of heavy American steel were already on the move, cutting through the night like a mechanical army. From the coastal highways to the desert interstates, they were converging on the small, unsuspecting town. The storm was coming, and it wore leather. Friday morning in Oildale dawned bright, cloudless, and painfully ordinary. At the local country club diner on the wealthy west side of town, Richard Preston sat in a plush leather booth, cutting into a plate of steak and eggs. Richard was a prominent local real estate developer and, more importantly to this story, the father of Bradley Preston. Bradley was the star quarterback of the high school football team, the golden boy of the town, and the primary architect of the relentless torment that had driven Daniel Miller to his grave. Across the table sat Principal Higgins, nervously stirring his coffee. "You're sure this will all blow over quietly, Richard?" Higgins asked, dabbing his forehead with a napkin. "The school board is terrified of the liability. If the press gets wind of the cyberbullying." Richard waved his fork dismissively, chewing a piece of steak. "Relax, Higgins. The Miller family has no money and no connections. The mother is a basket case, and the father has been out of the picture for a decade. I've spoken to the right people. Nobody is going to that funeral today. By Monday, this whole unfortunate incident will be old news, and Bradley's scholarship prospects won't be tainted by some fragile kid from the trailer park." 2 miles away, at St. Jude's, a crumbling, weathered chapel with peeling white paint and the sagging roof, the reality was far bleaker. The parking lot was entirely empty, save for a rusted hearse and a beaten-up Ford sedan. Inside the stiflingly hot church, the silence was suffocating. Mr. Abernathy, the elderly funeral director, stood near the altar, looking at his watch with a heavy sigh. Resting on a cheap metal stand was the least expensive casket the parlor offered, a simple pine box painted dark brown. In the front pew sat Sarah Miller, Daniel's mother. She looked entirely broken, staring blankly at the wooden box holding her son. Her face was hollowed out by grief, her eyes red and vacant. Beside her sat 9-year-old Chloe, wearing her only nice dress, a faded, floral hand-me-down that was a size too big. She kept looking back over her shoulder at the heavy wooden doors of the church, her small hands twisting the fabric of her skirt into tight knots. "Mrs. Miller, Mr. Mother," Abernathy said softly, stepping down from the altar. "It's 9:45. We really need to proceed, but we have a logistical problem. I need 6 able-bodied men to carry the casket to the gravesite out back. My assistant called in sick, and it's just me." Sarah Miller didn't blink. She just pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her thin shoulders, the absolute picture of defeat. "They're coming," Chloe piped up, her voice trembling but defiant. "My friends are coming, Mr. Chior." Abernathy gave the little girl a pitying, sorrowful look. "Sweetheart, I don't think anyone else is coming." At exactly 9:50 a.m., the coffee in Richard Preston's cup back at the diner began to vibrate. It started as a low, almost imperceptible hum that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. Principal Higgins paused mid-sentence, looking around as the silverware on their table began to rattle against the porcelain plates. "Is that an earthquake?" Higgins asked, gripping the edge of the table. But it wasn't the earth shifting beneath tectonic plates. It was the synchronized combustion of hundreds of heavy-duty Vitz-Win engines. Back at St. Jude's, the stained-glass windows of the old chapel began to violently buzz in their lead frames. Mr. Abernathy froze, looking up at the ceiling in alarm. Chloe jumped up from the pew, a sudden bright spark of hope lighting up her tear-streaked face. She sprinted down the center aisle and pushed open the heavy oak doors. What she saw and what the entire town of Oildale was suddenly waking up to was a spectacle of biblical proportions. Cresting the hill on Route 46, a river of chrome black leather and roaring steel poured into the valley. It wasn't 10 bikes, it wasn't 50 bikes. It was an endless, terrifyingly disciplined cavalry of 700 Hell's Angels. They rode in a tight, staggered formation, the massive armored column taking up both lanes of the highway. The noise was apocalyptic, a deafening, thunderous roar that drowned out every other sound in the county. Leading the pack on his massive road king was Arthur Bear Sterling. Riding shoulder to shoulder with him was William Dutch Hollister, his president's patch gleaming in the morning sun. Behind them rode members from Oakland, San Jose, Vallejo, and nomads from across the Nevada border. Their cuts bore the infamous Death Head logo, a symbol of rebellion and fierce brotherhood now united under a single, unexpected cause. The local police force was instantly paralyzed. Sheriff Wayne Davies rushed out of the precinct, radioing for barricades, but it was useless. The sheer volume of motorcycles overwhelmed the streets. Traffic stopped entirely. People spilled out of the diner, out of the hardware store, out of their manicured suburban homes, standing on the sidewalks in stunned, open-mouthed disbelief as the terrifying procession rumbled past. Richard Preston and Principal Higgins pushed through the crowd outside the diner, watching in horror as the endless stream of bikers took the turn toward the poor side of town. "Where the hell are they going?" Preston demanded, his face turning pale as he realized the route led directly to St. Jude's. The procession pulled into the church's dirt parking lot. It wasn't nearly big enough. The bikers parked their heavy machines in perfect military-style rows, filling the lot, overflowing onto the dead grass of the lawns, and lining both sides of the street for a half-mile in either direction. When the engines were finally cut, the sudden sweeping silence that fell over the area was heavier and more intimidating than the roar had been. 700 massive, heavily tattooed, leather-clad men dismounted. The air smelled of hot exhaust, burning oil, and ozone. Chloe stood on the top step of the church. Her jaw dropped, her eyes wide with absolute awe. The sea of leather parted. Walking up the center of the pathway, looking like giants straight out of modern mythology, came Bear Dutch and the towering Sergeant-at-Arms, Iron Mike. Bear locked eyes with the little girl, a gentle, reassuring smile breaking through his thick beard. "Told you we'd be here, kid," Bear said, his deep voice carrying in the silent morning air. Sarah Miller stumbled out of the church doors behind her daughter, gasping as she took in the sight. Her legs gave out, and she slumped against the wooden doorframe, weeping not from sorrow but from a profound, overwhelming shock. The world that had completely abandoned her family had suddenly shown up in full force. "Ma'am," Dutch said, removing his sunglasses and nodding respectfully to Sarah. "I'm Dutch. We're here for Daniel." Before Sarah could formulate a sentence, the screech of tires shattered the moment. Sheriff Wayne Davies's cruiser, followed closely by Richard Preston's luxury SUV, hopped the curb and skidded to a halt near the front of the bikes. Preston leaped out of his car, his face purple with indignant rage. Sheriff Davies looked terrified, his hand resting hesitantly near his duty belt, heavily outmanned and completely out of his depth. "What is the meaning of this?" Preston shouted, marching toward the church steps. "You people don't have permits for a gathering of this size. This is a quiet town. You are disturbing the peace. Sheriff, arrest them for trespassing." 700 pairs of cold, hardened eyes turned to look at Richard Preston. The collective blare was enough to make the wealthy developer falter in his tracks. Dutch slowly turned around. He walked down the wooden steps, each heavy thud of his boots sounding like a judge's gavel. He stopped just inches from Preston's face. Dutch was a head taller, and his presence was overwhelmingly lethal. "Disturbing the peace?" Dutch asked, his voice deathly quiet, a deadly contrast to Preston's screeching. "Your son, Bradley, and his friends tormented a 16-year-old boy until he put a rope around his own neck. You and the rest of the cowards in this town decided to sweep it under the rug so your golden boy wouldn't lose his football scholarship. You threatened his neighbors. You made sure this church was empty." Preston swallowed hard, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. That is unfounded slander. You're a gang of thugs." Dutch leaned in closer. "We are the Hells Angels, and we have a very low tolerance for bullies. You thought Daniel Miller had nobody. You thought you could erase him. Take a good look around, Mr. Preston. Take a good look at Daniel's family." Dutch gestured broadly to the sea of 700 patched bikers flanking the church, standing in stoic, immovable silence. "We are his family now," Dutch growled, "and we are going to bury our brother with the respect he deserves. If you or anyone else in this town ever speaks ill of this boy, or if anyone ever so much as looks at his little sister the wrong way, you won't be dealing with the school board. He'll be dealing with me. Now get off this property before I lose my temper." "Not Sheriff Davies immediately grabbed Preston by the elbow, physically dragging the sputtering, terrified man back to his SUV. The town's supposed elite sped away, fully realizing that the balance of power in Oydell had just permanently shifted. Dutch turned back to the church, his hard expression softening as he looked at Chloe. "Let's go say goodbye to your brother." The scene inside St. Jude's was unprecedented. The pews were packed shoulder to shoulder with massive bikers. They stood along the walls, filled the back vestibule, and spilled out the open doors. Men who had lived through prison, warfare, and the hardest roads imaginable took off their sunglasses and bowed their heads in absolute pin-drop silence as Mr. Bill Abernathy, shaking but profoundly moved, delivered the shortest, most well-attended funeral service of his career. When it was time to move the casket, Mr. Abernathy didn't need to ask for volunteers. Bear, Dutch, Iron Mike, and 3 other massive angels from the Oakland Charter stepped forward. They lifted the cheap pine box with effortless synchronized reverence. They carried Daniel Miller down the center aisle, passing through a gauntlet of respect that kings would envy. Out in the small, overgrown cemetery behind the church, the California sun beat down as the casket was lowered into the earth. Sarah Miller leaned heavily against Bear's side, drawing strength from the giant man who had kept his promise. As the service concluded, Dutch did something that left the attending members in stunned silence. The president reached into his coat and pulled out a small, custom-made piece of heavy black leather. It was a miniature vest. Sewn onto the back was a solitary, pristine patch. He stepped to the edge of the grave and gently dropped the leather down onto the casket. It was the ultimate sacred gesture. Daniel Miller, the boy who dreamed of riding free, the boy the town tried to discard, was going into the earth under the eternal protection of the club. Dutch looked across the grave at Chloe. "He's riding on the best highways now, little sister. Nobody can ever hurt him again. After the dirt was moved, the bikers didn't leave immediately. They stayed shaking hands with a bewildered but deeply grateful Sarah Miller. They emptied their pockets, taking up a quiet collection that filled a helmet with enough cash to pay off the funeral expenses and ensure Chloe and her mother wouldn't have to worry about rent for a very long time. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cemetery, the deep rumble of engines starting up signaled the end. The earth shook once more as the 700 riders formed up, a massive column of steel and Brotherhood preparing to head back to the highways they called home. Bear knelt down one last time in front of Chloe. He reached out and tapped her gently on the nose. "You remember what Dutch told that man today? Nou, laxt, nad, amma." Chloe nodded, her eyes dry now, filled with a new, unbreakable, fierce light. "You're not alone anymore," Bear said, his voice thick with emotion. "You got 700 uncles watching your back. You ever need anything, you tell the wind, and we'll hear it." With a final nod, Bear mounted his Road King. He revved the engine, the thunderous sound blending with hundreds of others. As the massive convoy pulled out of the dirt lot, rolling out of Waldau to leave the town forever changed, Chloe stood on the steps of the church waving until the very last bike disappeared over the horizon. The bullies of Oildale never spoke Daniel's name in disrespect again. The town learned a harsh, unforgettable lesson about the true nature of courage, and a little girl named Chloe learned that sometimes the most profound love, protection, and brotherhood in the world doesn't come in a suit and tie. Sometimes it arrives on two wheels, wearing heavy leather and a scowl, ready to shake the gates of hell for the ones who cannot fight for themselves. If this incredible, real-life story of brotherhood and standing up to bullies touched your heart, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another powerful, true story. Drop a comment below to honor Daniel's memory. Ride free, and thank you for watching. Hundreds of roaring Harley-Davidson engines suddenly rattled the diner's windows, sending violent tremors through the sticky floorboards. Thomas froze, his knuckles turning white around a trembling coffee pot. Hours earlier, he had sacrificed his job to defend a lone, battered biker. Now, the notorious Hell's Angels were surrounding the building. It was a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in mid-July. Rusty's Diner, an aging, neon-lit relic situated just off Interstate 15 in Barstow, California, was a haven for weary truckers, lost tourists, and locals trying to escape the Mojave Desert heat. The air inside was a thick, suffocating mix of frying bacon, old bleach, and stale coffee. Thomas Reynolds, a 26-year-old waiter with dark circles under his eyes and a mountain of student debt, was on hour 10 of a grueling 14-hour double shift. Thomas wiped down a cracked vinyl booth, his mind drifting to the final notice on his mother's medical bills sitting on his kitchen counter. He couldn't afford to lose this job, no matter how much his manager, a sweaty, anxious man named Richard, loved to threaten him with termination over the smallest infractions. The diner bell chimed, slicing through the low hum of the ceiling fans. In walked Trouble, disguised in pastel polo shirts and expensive loafers. It was Bradley Sutton and his usual crew. Bradley was the 20-something son of a prominent local real estate developer. He and his three friends treated Barstow like their personal playground, shielded by his father's deep pockets and local political connections. They swaggered to the center of the diner, pulling together two tables and shouting their orders at a young waitress before she had even handed them menus. They were loud, obnoxious, and already 3 sheets to the wind from a liquid lunch. Thomas groaned inwardly, intentionally avoiding their section. He walked back behind the counter to brew a fresh pot of decaf. 10 minutes later, the door chimed again. This time, the atmosphere in the diner visibly shifted. An older man stepped out of the blinding California sun and into the dim diner. He was a mountain of a man, though age and hard miles had weathered him. A thick, silver beard cascaded down his chest, and deep lines mapped his face. He wore faded denim jeans, heavy engineer boots, and a weathered leather vest. On the back of that vest was the unmistakable winged skull, the Death's Head. Above it, the curved top rocker read, Hell's Angels, and the bottom rocker proudly displayed California. The small rectangular patch on his chest read Artie. River Artie Rollins wasn't just a rider. The patches indicated he was a fully patched, veteran member of the world's most infamous motorcycle club. However, Artie looked exhausted. He walked with a pronounced, painful limp, favoring his left leg, and his leather cut was caked in a fresh layer of pale desert dust. His bike, a classic, customized panhead, sat ticking in the parking lot, the exhaust pipes cooling in the shade of a lone billboard. Artie didn't swagger. He didn't demand attention. He simply dragged his boots to a quiet corner booth far away from the windows, removed his sunglasses, and let out a long, heavy sigh. Thomas grabbed a menu and walked over. "Afternoon, sir. What can I get you started with?" Artie looked up, his pale blue eyes sharp despite the fatigue. "Just a large black coffee, son, and a slice of cherry pie. If it's fresh." His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that sounded like tires on a dirt road. "Coming right up," Thomas said with a polite nod. As Thomas poured the coffee, he noticed Bradley Sutton's table growing louder. They were tossing crumpled napkins at each other, their braying laughter echoing off the tin ceiling. Bradley, holding a half-empty glass of iced tea, stood up to dramatically reenact a story to his friends. As he stepped backward, he carelessly bumped hard into Artie's booth. The heavy thud jolted the table, sending Artie's freshly poured black coffee sloshing over the brim of the ceramic mug and splashing directly onto the biker's weathered leather vest and jeans. The diner went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Even the fry cook peered out from the kitchen window. Bradley turned around, looking down at the seated biker. Instead of an apology, a smirk crawled across Bradley's flushed face. "Whoops. Watch where you're sitting, Grandpa." Artie didn't immediately react. He slowly picked up a paper napkin and began dabbing the scalding coffee off his patches. He didn't look at Bradley. He just stared at his ruined pie and sighed. "It's a big diner, kid. Plenty of room to walk." Bradley's friend snickered, emboldened by his audience and the alcohol in his system. Bradley leaned in closer, invading Artie's space. "What did you call me?" "You look like you belong in a museum, old man. Isn't it a little hot to be wearing a Halloween costume?" Thomas, watching from the counter, felt his stomach drop. He looked around for Richard, the manager, but Richard was conveniently hiding in his back office, peering through the blinds. "Leave it alone, Brad," one of his friends muttered, noticing the heavy leather and the grim reaper patch. "Let's just sit down." Nah. Bradley laughed, pointing a manicured finger at Artie's chest. "I want to know what makes these biker trash guys think they own the road. Look at this guy. He can barely walk. What's that patch mean? Anyway, you in a little boys' club." Artie finally stopped wiping his vest. He balled the wet napkin up and placed it on the table. He looked up at Bradley, his expression completely unreadable. A terrifying, ice-cold stillness radiated from the older man. "I've had a very long ride," Artie said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. "And a very bad week. Walk away, boy. Before your mouth writes a check your body can't cash." Bradley burst into laughter, slamming his hand on Artie's table. "Are you threatening me? Do you know who my dad is? I could buy this diner and ban you and your trashy little tricycle club from ever stepping foot in this town." Thomas couldn't take it anymore. The injustice of it, the sheer, arrogant cruelty of picking on an exhausted old man, made his blood boil, disregarding his manager's strict, never upset the wealthy locals policy. Thomas dropped his serving tray on the counter and marched toward the corner booth. "Is there a problem here?" "Bradley." Thomas's voice sliced through the tension, firm and unwavering. Bradley spun around, looking Thomas up and down with undisguised contempt. "Yeah, Tommy boy, there's a problem. This greasy relic is stinking up the place. We're trying to eat." Thomas stepped directly between Bradley and the booth, physically shielding Artie from the young millionaire's son. He was sitting here quietly. "You spilled his coffee. You need to return to your table, or you need to leave. Now." The color drained from the faces of Bradley's friends. They weren't used to anyone in town, let alone a minimum-wage waiter, standing up to them. Bradley stepped into Thomas's personal space, jabbing a finger into Thomas's chest. "You ordering me around? Apron, I drop more in tips here in a month than you make in a year." "Richard," Bradley yelled toward the back office. "Richard, get out here and fire this insolent prick." Richard pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, dabbing his sweating forehead with a handkerchief. "Thomas, what on earth are you doing? Apologize to Mr. Sutton this instant." "I won't," Thomas said, his jaw locked tight. "He's harassing a customer. I'm telling him to leave." "You don't tell Mr. Sutton to leave," Richard shrieked, his face turning purple. "You're a waiter. Back off and apologize, or you're done here. Reynolds, I mean it." Thomas looked back at Artie. The old biker was watching him intently, a flicker of surprise in his steel-blue eyes. Thomas thought about his rent. He thought about the medical bills. He thought about the empty fridge waiting for him at home. But then he looked at the arrogant, sneering face of Bradley Sutton, and something inside him snapped. Morality outweighed money today. "No," Thomas said quietly. Then, louder, he looked Bradley dead in the eye. "Get out of the diner. Bradley, you're cut off. You're trespassing. And if you don't walk out that door right now, I'm calling the highway patrol." Bradley's jaw dropped. He looked at Richard, expecting the manager to physically throw Thomas out, but Richard was paralyzed by cowardice. Bradley scoffed, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "You're making a huge mistake. Loser." Bradley spat. He dug into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and threw it hard onto the floor at Thomas's feet. "Keep the change. You're going to need it since you just lost your job for defending biker trash." Bradley turned his glare to Artie one last time. "You got lucky this time, old man. Next time I see you on the highway, I'll run you off it." With that, Bradley and his crew stormed out of the diner. The door slammed shut behind them, the bell jangling wildly. Moments later, the screech of tires echoed as their customized Jeep tore out of the parking lot. The diner remained silent for a long moment. Thomas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Thomas' office. Now. Richard barked, spinning on his heel and storming away, before Thomas could follow. A heavy, calloused hand gently grabbed his forearm. Thomas looked down. Artie was standing up, favoring his good leg. "You shouldn't have done that." "Kid," Artie said, his gravelly voice softer now, tinged with genuine concern. "I can handle my own battles. You just lost your livelihood over a spilled cup of coffee." "It wasn't about the coffee, sir," Thomas said, offering a tired smile. "It was about respect. Nobody deserves to be treated like that, especially not in my section." Artie stared at Thomas for a long time. It was a calculating, deep look, as if the old biker was reading Thomas's soul, searching for an ulterior motive and finding none. Artie reached into his leather cut, pulled out a thick leather wallet attached to a heavy chain, and withdrew a crisp, newly minted $100 bill. He placed it on the table next to his untouched, ruined pie. "Pay for the coffee. Keep the rest," Artie said. "I can't take that," Thomas protested, shaking his head. "You can, and you will," Artie commanded, though not unkindly. He adjusted his leather vest, the heavy chains and pins clinking together. "What's your full name?" "Son, Thomas Reynolds." Artie nodded slowly, committing the name to memory. "Thomas Reynolds. I'm Artie. You're a rare breed of kid. Thomas, stand tall." Without another word, Artie limped heavily toward the door. Thomas watched as the old man swung his leg over his panhead, kicked the starter, and roared off down Interstate 15, disappearing into the shimmering desert heat waves. Thomas picked up the $100 bill, slid it into his apron, and walked into Richard's office. "Hand over your apron, Reynolds," Richard said, not even looking up from his desk. "You're a liability. Sutton's father practically owns the bank that holds the mortgage on this building. You're fired. Clean out your locker and get off the property." Thomas didn't argue. He untied his apron, tossed it onto the chair, and walked down the back hallway to the break room. As he gathered his jacket and his backpack, a heavy feeling of dread settled in his stomach. He had done the right thing, but doing the right thing didn't pay the electricity bill. It took Thomas nearly an hour to finish paperwork with Richard and pack up his things. By the time he finally pushed through the back exit doors and walked into the dusty employee parking lot, the desert sun was beginning to set, casting long, fiery orange shadows across the Barstow pavement. He walked toward his beat-up Honda Civic, fumbling for his keys. The air was deathly still. The usual hum of the highway traffic seemed to have died down. Then he heard it. It started as a low, distant vibration, a rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Thomas paused, his key halfway into the car door. The rumble grew louder, deeper, transforming into a synchronized, guttural roar that echoed off the surrounding desert canyons. It didn't sound like a passing semi-truck. It sounded like thunder rolling across the blacktop. Thomas turned toward the interstate. Over the crest of the off-ramp, a headlight appeared. Then 2, then 10, then 50. A massive, tightly packed formation of motorcycles was pouring off the highway, riding two abreast in perfect, disciplined synchronization. The chrome of their bikes flashed violently in the dying sunlight. At the front of the pack, riding a massive, gleaming road glide, was a man wearing a crisp white helmet. Beside him, riding shotgun in the formation, was Artie on his old panhead. Behind them were dozens upon dozens of men, all wearing the heavy leather cuts, all bearing the winged skull of the Hells Angels. The sheer volume of the noise was deafening, a mechanical symphony of raw horsepower and intimidation, and they were all turning their blinkers on, aiming directly for the parking lot of Rusty's diner. The ground trembled beneath Thomas's worn sneakers. He stood frozen by the door of his beat-up Honda Civic as the endless procession of heavy American iron flooded the diner's dusty parking lot. The Hells Angels didn't just park, they executed a tactical encirclement. Bikes flanked the entrance,
wrapped around the drive-through lane and completely blocked both the entrance and exit ramps to the highway. Inside the diner, Thomas saw the blinds snap shut. Richard had locked the glass doors, killing the neon "open" sign and effectively abandoning his newly fired waiter to whatever fate awaited him outside. Engines cut out one by one, leaving a ringing silence in the desert air, broken only by the ticking of cooling exhaust pipes and the heavy crunch of leather boots hitting the gravel. Over 100 men wearing the Death's Head patch dismounted in unison. They didn't yell or charge. They moved with a terrifying, organized calm. The crowd parted down the middle. Artie, the old biker from earlier, limped forward. Beside him was the man who had been leading the pack, a towering figure with a thick, dark beard, mirrored aviator sunglasses, and a chest like a whiskey barrel. His bottom rocker read California, and a small patch over his heart read President. "That him?" the giant man asked, his voice a low, booming rumble. "That's him," Artie replied, pulling a cigar from his vest. "That's Thomas." Thomas swallowed hard, his hands sweaty. He had defended one biker, but he had no idea what the protocol was for facing down an entire charter. I don't work here anymore," Thomas stammered, pointing a thumb at the diner. "Richard fired me right after you left." The president removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes as hard as flint. He stepped up to Thomas, extending a massive, calloused hand wrapped in silver skull rings. "Name is Clayton, president of the charter. Artie here called us from a gas station down the road, told us some rich kid put hands on him, and a local kid in an apron stood between them." Thomas tentatively shook Clayton's hand. The grip was like a vice, but not aggressive. He was out of line. "I just did what anyone should have done." "Maybe," Clayton said, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. "But in our experience, anyone usually turns a blind eye. You didn't." Before Thomas could respond, the deep, rattling roar of a modified diesel engine echoed from the highway. A battered, matte black tow truck rumbled up to the police barricade of motorcycles. The bikers seamlessly moved their Harley-Davidsons to part the sea, allowing the heavy truck to pull directly to the center of the lot. Driven by a hulking biker with tattoos crawling up his neck, the truck hissed to a halt, but it wasn't towing a car. "Bring 'em out!" "Tiny!" Clayton barked. Tiny hopped out of the cab, walked around to the bed of the tow truck, and unlatched the heavy tailgate. "Out! Now!" Tiny growled. Thomas's jaw dropped. Stumbling out of the back of the dirty truck bed, covered in grease and looking like they had seen a ghost, were Bradley Sutton and his two friends. Bradley's designer polo was stained, his expensive loafers scuffed, and his previously arrogant face was completely drained of color. He was physically trembling. "How did you?" Thomas whispered in disbelief. "A brother's bike gets recognized," Artie said, lighting his cigar. "So does a customized Jeep driven by a loudmouth kid. One of our prospects spotted them at a burger stand 2 towns over. We thought it'd be polite to invite them back to finish their conversation." Clayton walked slowly toward Bradley. The young millionaire's son shrank back, bumping into the side of the truck. He looked around at the sea of leather and chains, realizing instantly that his father's money and political connections meant absolutely nothing out here in the dirt. I didn't mean anything by it," Bradley stammered, his voice cracking. "It was a joke, just a joke." "A joke," Clayton repeated softly. He leaned in, towering over Bradley. "Artie rode point for this club for 30 years. He has 2 metal plates in his leg from a crash that saved a brother's life. He earned the right to drink his coffee in peace. You spilled it. You insulted the patch. And then you got this kid fired. I'll pay, Bradley cried out, pulling out his designer wallet. Whatever you want, I can write a check. Clayton struck the wallet out of Bradley's hand. It hit the gravel, credit cards spilling out into the dirt. We don't want your daddy's money, boy. We want respect. And you're going to learn how to show it. Clayton lifted a thick, ringed finger and pointed toward the diner doors. Inside, Richard crouched behind the register, fumbling with the phone, panic written across his face as neon light flickered over him. Tiny, Clayton said quietly, his voice cutting through the still air. Go get the manager. Tiny didn't hesitate. One heavy kick shattered the glass door, sending fragments scattering across the floor. He reached through, unlocked it, and stepped inside. Seconds later, he returned, dragging Richard by the collar. The man stumbled helplessly before being thrown into the dirt at Clayton's feet. Please, Richard begged, raising his hands. Take the money, just don't hurt me. Clayton crouched slowly, calm and deliberate. We're not thieves, he said, but we don't tolerate men who steal from their own workers. He pulled out a worn notebook. We know about the tips, the overtime you've been skimming. 2 years' worth. Richard froze, his fear deepening into something worse exposure. Go empty your safe, Clayton continued coldly. Every dollar you took from this kid. Bring it out. Now. Richard scrambled up and ran back inside without another word. As he disappeared, Clayton turned to Bradley Sutton. The young man leaned against the tow truck, shaken but still clinging to arrogance. You think this scares me, Bradley snapped. My father owns half this county. One call, and you're finished. A low ripple of amusement spread through the bikers. Clayton pulled out his phone. William Sutton. Right. Bradley smirked. Yeah, you should start apologizing. Clayton dialed. The phone rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. Sharp and controlled, William Sutton speaking. The parking lot went completely silent. Billy? Clayton rumbled. It's Clayton. San Bernardino. The color instantly drained from Bradley's face. On the other end of the line, the authoritative tone vanished, replaced by a sudden, nervous stammer. Clayton, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. Is there a problem with the union guys at the New Vegas site? I thought we squared the security contracts last month. The contracts are fine. Billy, Clayton said, locking eyes with Bradley. The problem is closer to home. Your boy, Bradley. He's down here at Rusty's Diner off the 15. He decided to publicly humiliate one of my senior patch holders, threw coffee on him, insulted the club. Then he got a good kid fired just for stepping in. There was a dead, horrifying silence on the speakerphone. When William Sutton finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, thick with pure dread. Clayton, please, he's an idiot. He doesn't know who you are. He doesn't know about our arrangement. He was just telling me how you're going to bury us, Billy, Clayton said smoothly. Something about the district attorney. No. William practically screamed through the phone. Clayton, listen to me. I disavow whatever he said. Do whatever you have to do to teach him a lesson. I won't interfere. Please, just don't let this affect our business. I'll cut off his trust fund today. Just leave my company out of this. Appreciate the understanding. Billy, we'll handle his education, Clayton said, and ended the call. Bradley's legs gave out. He slid down the side of the matte black tow truck, landing in the dirt. The ultimate twist of the knife wasn't the bikers. It was the realization that the empire he hid behind was utterly powerless against the men standing in front of him. His own father had just handed him over to the Hells Angels. "Now," Clayton said, stepping over to the trembling young man. "For the arsehole tax. The kid here has medical bills for his mother. 6 grand. And since your daddy just cut off your allowance, I guess we'll have to take collateral." Clayton pointed to Bradley's wrist. "That Rolex. Hand it over." Without a word, a broken... Sobbing, Bradley unclasped the heavy gold watch and dropped it into Clayton's outstretched hand. Clayton didn't keep it. He tossed it directly to Thomas, who fumbled and caught the heavy gold timepiece. "Sell it," Clayton ordered Thomas. "It'll cover the medical debt, plus interest." Just then, Richard emerged from the diner, clutching a thick manila envelope. He practically threw it at Thomas's chest before scurrying back toward the safety of the shattered doorway. Thomas opened the envelope. It was stuffed with banded stacks of small bills, easily $2,000 of skimmed tips and unpaid overtime. But the Brotherhood wasn't finished. Clayton unclipped his heavy black helmet from his road glide. He held it upside down and pulled a thick money clip from his pocket, peeling off 2 crisp $100 bills and dropping them into the helmet. He passed it to Artie, who silently added his own cash. Then the helmet moved through the crowd. It was a surreal, hypnotic ritual. Over 100 tough, road-hardened bikers men with scarred knuckles, facial tattoos, and criminal records each reached into their leather cuts. 50s, 20s, and hundreds fluttered into the helmet. The only sound was the rustle of cash and the distant howl of the desert wind. When the helmet finally made its way back to the front, it was heavy, practically overflowing with green paper. Clayton took the helmet and pressed it firmly into Thomas's chest. "You stood up for the patch." "Thomas," Clayton said, his voice carrying a solemn weight. "You stood up for a brother when you had everything to lose. The Hells Angels don't forget disrespect, but we never forget loyalty. This is from the San Bernardino Charter. Take this money. Take the watch. Take your back pay. Get out of this dead-end town and take care of your mother." Thomas felt a hot tear escape and track down his cheek. He clutched the helmet, the physical weight of the cash representing a massive, life-altering freedom. "I don't know what to say. Thank you, all of you." Artie leaned over his handlebars, offering a rare, genuine smile. "Just keep your spine straight. Kid, you did good today." Clayton turned his back on Thomas and focused a withering glare on Bradley and his 2 terrified friends. "You 3 are going to walk back to town. It's 20 miles of dark highway. If I ever see you driving on Interstate 15 again, your Jeep is going over the guardrail into a canyon. Do we understand each other?" "Yes," Bradley croaked, tears streaming down his dust-caked face. "Start walking." Bradley and his friends didn't hesitate. Leaving behind their pride and their customized vehicle, they turned and began a miserable, terrified power walk down the gravel shoulder of the pitch-black highway. Clayton swung his massive leg over his bike and hit the ignition. The deafening roar of the engine shattered the quiet night. Behind him, 100 more engines sparked to life, a synchronized symphony of power and mechanical fury. The ground shook violently as the massive pack of Hell's Angels rode right past Thomas, their headlights cutting through the darkness, pulling into the diner's drive-thru to demand the endless coffee and food Richard now owed them. Thomas stood alone in the parking lot. He looked at the shattered glass of Rusty's diner, then down at the fortune in his hands. He didn't look back again. He climbed into his beat-up Honda Civic, placed the helmet full of cash and the gold Rolex gently onto the passenger seat, and drove off into the cool desert night, leaving Barstow and his old life behind forever. That day, Thomas learned that true respect isn't bought with Daddy's money. It's earned through courage. The Hells Angels showed him that brotherhood and honor exist in the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed this incredible true story of karma and respect, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life stories. See you next time.